Welcome to Boss Talk. My name is Jim Parker. This is my business partner, Carey Sobel. Boss Talk is where we talk about selling businesses.
Today's episode is buyer-seller meetings, a critical part of selling businesses. And a buyer-seller meeting is really interesting. It can be fun, it can be funny, it can also be very uncomfortable. There's a lot of different situations that happen in buyer-seller meetings. For sellers, it's oftentimes a little intimidating, especially if it's the first time that they've done a buyer-seller meeting. For buyers, it's usually a little less intimidating because they're the ones asking the questions. They're exploring what's going on about the business. It's a little more organic. But either way, we like to keep a little bit of structure in these buyer-seller meetings, so we're going to talk about that today. And while everyone is different, there are some standard things that we like to accomplish in a buyer-seller meeting. There's some do's, there's some don'ts, but let's just dive right into it. So Jim, you've done a lot of buyer-seller meetings, definitely more than me. And you've probably experienced some more things than me, but overall, we have the same goal of a buyer-seller meeting. What do you really think is the purpose of getting a buyer and a seller together?
Well, Carey, up to that point, obviously the buyer has received the SIM, Confidential Information Memorandum, where it talks about the business, and we also share a video a lot of times where we interview the seller. So the buyer's going to that meeting kind of getting a good idea of how the business is, but they really want to talk to the seller and learn a lot more about the business, ask more deeper questions, and it also gives the opportunity for the seller to learn about the buyer and see if that buyer is the appropriate person to acquire the business, because at the end of the day, that's their business. They started it from scratch. It's their baby.
Yeah.
So you want both parties to kind of, discover each other and see if it's a good fit. And I think at the end of the day, the most critical thing is that the buyer likes and trusts the seller, and the seller likes and trusts the buyer.
Absolutely.
And that I think is the most critical thing. I mean, obviously they need to both understand, if it's a good match for each other. But you know how it is, Carey. Most people out there, when they're selling a business, a large part is this somebody that I think could take over my business, keep my business operating, keep my employees employed, take care of my clients and my customers, but also they want to feel like they like the person.
Yeah.
And the buyer, they're going to have the opportunity once they go under contract to do their due diligence. And they're going to do their due diligence to make sure that the business really is what the seller's claiming it is. But at the end of the day, they are going to be taking that little bit of leap of faith. Mm-hmm. And they've got to like and trust the seller.
Yeah, we've said that a business doesn't close unless the buyer and seller can trust each other. They can build some rapport and get to the closing table, because when a business sells, the seller's not gone. The buyer doesn't feel like they completely own the business yet, right? There's a little bit of continuity that needs to exist between the buyer and seller. And if they don't like each other, it's going to be pretty hard to get that done.
Absolutely. It's not like selling a house. When you're selling a house, you really don't care who the buyer is. You just want to make sure that you got the price you wanted for the house. When a buyer's buying a house, they really don't care who the seller is. They just want to have the house that they can raise their family in.
It's not a legacy for them.
Exactly.
It's a material. It's a place they live. It's not something that a seller maybe ran the business for 20, 30 years. It's their legacy. So, a buyer, of course, is interviewing a seller to see, do they want to buy the business? But you had a really good point. The seller is interviewing the buyer to make sure it's the right person to carry the torch and baton of that business moving forward. It might be their legacy that they're representing.
Right, exactly. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that you got to remember. If you're a seller out there, you're selling your business, that buyer-seller meeting is very, very critical, obviously, because the buyer is discovering about that business. But you, as the business owner, one of the biggest things that you can do is be likable and be trustworthy and show them who you really are. And for the buyer, you got to remember that the seller might have a couple offers coming in, and a lot of times it comes down to not just price and terms, but who the seller feels most comfortable with.
Absolutely. So trust is so important. I say one thing before a buyer-seller meeting all the time is that a deal does not get done if a buyer and a seller can't establish trust and rapport with each other. If they can't do that, no matter what else happens with the deal, it's probably not going to get to the closing table.
Exactly.
So let's go into structure of these things, right? Because they go very different. And I know in a future episode where we talk about horror stories, my first buyer-seller meeting, I questioned if I even wanted to be in this space because of how bad that buyer-seller meeting was. And I can't wait. I think I've told you this story before, but we'll get into it in another episode. But general structure, while it may vary, there's some simple things that happen in almost every one. And our role as brokers in them is really to facilitate the conversation, right? We kind of sit back a little bit and let the buyer and the seller do their thing, but There's times where if it gets off track, or a buyer's asking questions that he shouldn't ask, or a seller's saying things that he shouldn't say, we just try to guide the conversation. Let's talk about the structure. How do you open up a buyer-seller?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go any further, Carey, let's make it clear to the people that are watching that there could be a buyer-seller meeting that's happening by Zoom or by phone call.
Very true.
And then we have a buyer-seller meeting that's happening in person. Yep. And a lot of times what we like to do is we like to have that buyer-seller phone call or a Zoom call first.
Yes.
Make sure, because, if you're going to do an in-person meeting, obviously you want to do it when the employees aren't there, and so you're going there after hours or before hours or on the weekend, and, it's just more convenient to do it over a phone call or a Zoom at first, because sometimes, the buyer and the seller get on the call and they realize it's just not a good fit. And that way it's just saving everybody's time, especially going out at night or on the weekend. So it's good to start with that phone call and Zoom call, but whether it's a phone call, Zoom call, or an in-person meeting, the structure kind of stays the same.
It does.
For both. So, the first thing is the introductions, introducing both parties. That's usually what I do. Mr. Seller, this is the buyer, Mr. Buyer, this is the seller, and do that simple introductions. Then, we kind of lay out how the meeting's going to go. Why don't we start off by, Mr. Buyer talking a little bit about yourself, your background, your experience, why you're looking to acquire a business, and why you like this business in particular. And then after we get done with that, maybe, seller, if you can talk a little bit about the business just for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session. The only difference between a Zoom call, phone call / an in-person meeting is obviously we're going to take a tour of the facility as well. And I usually like to do that in the beginning, as soon as the buyer gets done talking about themselves, and then we sit down and do a Q&A.
So you do the Q&A after you walk around. It gives you a little bit more, or the buyer some more, I don't know if tangibility is a word, but they can see it, right?
More questions to come up in their mind, because after they take that tour of that facility.
And I feel like a lot of times when they're walking around the facility, more questions obviously come up, but they're walking around, they're chopping it up, they're talking, they may say, oh, what's your favorite sports team, where are you from, if they don't get into the personal part. So I do the exact same thing. Buyer, tell us about why you're interested, tell us about yourself. Seller, tell us about why you're selling and tell us about yourself. And there's usually some common thread. There was one time I was in a buyer-seller meeting, and buyer and seller were from the same hometown.
Oh, really?
And they didn't know that until they started talking, and they were talking about high school that they went to and what collegiate or high school sports that they played. So it really started.
That's a great way to get a good rapport going.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, but that beginning structure that we talked about is pretty much the way it opens up, and then we kind of just go.
Exactly.
Sit back and let them do their thing, right?
Exactly. And, to backtrack, we're talking about sports teams and things like that, in the sim, we like to, when we do that interview, this is before the buyer-seller meeting, this is when we're in the listing process and getting the business ready for the market, we do an interview, myself or you do an interview with the seller, and we're asking the seller questions. And one set of those questions is asking the seller personal information, like, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do? You have any sports teams that you follow? And we're asking those kind of questions.
Kids, children.
Family, kids, grandkids, whatever it is, because then you're writing that story about the seller, and buyers want to know who the seller is behind the business. That's who is that person. But also what it does is that maybe they pick things out and they're like, oh my gosh, he likes hunting or fishing or whatever it is, motorboating or golfing, whatever it is. And then, so when you get the two parties together, the buyer can say, oh, I saw that you're a great golfer. I love golfing, and it gets that rapport going.
It's huge. And it's, especially Main Street businesses too, where an individual owner of the business is a little bit closer to the business, and the buyer coming in is going to pretty much remove that person and step in themselves. It's that much more important that they can find that common thread, so that they feel good about each other. And it's I enjoy the buyer-seller meetings where it's lax and it's not so structured that it feels uncomfortable, right? So we try to break the ice a little bit and
make it more natural. Natural feeling.
Doing these seller interviews too, and sending that video to a buyer not only makes them feel more comfortable with the person that they're about to have a conversation with, but when we do these seller interviews, what it does is it answers a lot of the questions that the buyer has prior to getting to the meeting. There is so much fatigue for sellers to do buyer-seller meetings in a large quantity. I can't tell you how many times I'm working with a seller and they're like, I don't want to do another one of these. It's the same dog and pony show. So what we try to do is optimize the process, optimize our practice, and save everybody's time. There hasn't been a time where I've sent a video out to a buyer about a seller interview, and they were so reluctant about watching it, right? Because they're curious about, how the seller presents himself, what they have to say. There's a couple times where somebody will say, I'm old school, I got to meet face to face in person. I respect that.
Yeah, I do too.
But let's first see if there's a reason to avoid the meeting. Because, setting the meeting up, balancing calendars, making sure you're going there at a time probably after work. So somebody works 9 to 5 and they have to stay there from 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. It gets tiring when you do a ton of those.
Yeah, and then you get together, and then the buyer realizes in the first 10 minutes, oh, this business isn't for me for some reason.
Yeah.
Or the seller's like, this buyer is probably not the best buyer, for the business. They're not going to be the most successful. So that initial phone call is critical.
Yeah.
And Carey, I like what you said, and I know we're kind of getting off track, but doing that seller interview, and just to make it clear for you guys out there watching, what we're talking about, if it isn't clear, is after the business is listed for sale, before we take it to the market, we like to do an interview, by a video interview, the broker and yourself as the seller, asking a bunch of questions that a buyer usually asks on the initial phone call. Now, those questions we've already asked earlier in a different session, and we've had a writer write up an essay about your business, which a graphic designer designed. So that information is already coming across. But even if the buyer can read that information, they like to hear it from the seller themselves.
No doubt.
And so when they go to the buyer-seller phone call or the buyer-seller in-person meeting, they tend to ask those same questions again, even though it's in the marketing piece that they're reading. They want to hear it directly from the seller. So by recording that interview, they are hearing that information. And what's been incredible about this situation is we started this about 1.5 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And what's incredible about this is either the phone calls, the initial phone calls are shorter because the buyer doesn't feel like they have to ask as many questions, or the questions are deeper questions and not so much surface questions. And actually, a couple times last year, I got offers on businesses and they never met the seller. Because they felt comfortable between the sim and they felt comfortable about that video. Now, at that point, I told the buyer, that's great. Great that you're putting an offer in. I'll definitely give that offer to the seller, but let's can't take the offer serious until there's actually a conversation going.
No doubt.
I think that conversation that the buyer and the seller have, you have to have that before a seller can make a decision they want to accept that.
To move forward and say, hey, we're engaged now. We're moving towards getting married. So
that's for both parties.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And, in this business, there's so much wasted time. So for us as brokers, the quicker a deal gets done, the more profitable we are. We're on to the next one. For a seller,
less headaches for them.
Less headaches.
Less headaches for the buyer.
And we really say we're just trying to preserve your time. So every step we take leading up to a buyer-seller meeting, we want people to sit down at a table feeling like they know a lot about the business, as much as they can about each other. So like you said, when they sit down, they're asking deeper questions. Like, I cringe when I get to a buyer-seller meeting and they do ask the same questions that were stated in the BLI, they were stated in the BP, they were stated in the SIM, they were stated in a video, and they sit down and go, why do you want to sell? Well, he answered that on video.
Right.
So I still understand that it's part of the process, but for me, I'm like, let's get to why we're actually here.
Right. And I think that a lot of times buyers do that. One is they want to hear it directly from the seller.
They want to look in the eyes.
Yeah, they want to look in the
truth.
eyes. And I think the other thing is they want to see if the consistency is there.
Very true.
It's very the consistency for all the questions are there.
So if we used to say, I was taught originally to say it typically takes about 6 to 12 months to sell a business. So what we're trying to do is expedite that as much as we can. And we have so many tactics that we now do that help that. And one of the ways that a buyer-seller meeting can get expedited, or it can be a more best use of time, is having these cursory tools that we use to try to build some rapport of the buyer and the seller from seller interviews and whatnot. But again, I don't even think it's old school when somebody says, hey, I'm an old school guy, I want to meet face to face. No, we want you to meet face to face. But if there's a way that we can prevent that meeting because it's not a good fit, rather than have a buyer-seller meeting and in the first 10 minutes, like you said, the buyer's going, this isn't for me.
Right.
Well, we're still going to do the tour, we're still going to do all the introductions, because it can't just end abruptly and then the buyer gets up and leaves. That would be awkward. They'll stay there for no reason, and they already know that they're not buying that business. We want to avoid that.
And the big thing too is for you buyers that are out there listening, is that, the seller is a business owner. They're trying to operate and own that business, and they're trying to keep the business going, and they got a lot of stuff to do. They're a business owner, and they have all these things to do, and then they're trying to sell the business on top of that. And, obviously we're taking the burden of that work that we're doing, and we're taking that off the seller's shoulders, but it is still time consuming for the business owner themselves. So, you got to keep that in mind too. The business owner's working 40, 50 hours a week running the business, and then all these other things that they need to do during the process is on top of that. So all Carey and I are saying is that we're trying to reduce that and make it more efficient for the seller themselves.
And so this is kind of funny, and I haven't actually experienced this, but I know our other partner has. Are there certain buyers that when they pop up and they're requesting buyer-seller meetings that maybe you've had one with before that you're like, oh, God, I want to try to avoid this? They're never actually going to buy. They're just shopping. They request so many meetings, and you really try to play gatekeeper a little bit from them.
There's some names that I see out there that I think not just us, but a lot of other companies see
No,
that they've been around for many, many years, and they're just endlessly searching for a business, and they just don't ever end up buying a business. And I know that it takes a long time to really identify as a buyer which that you're finding the right business to buy.
It's a big decision.
But some people are just never going to pull that trigger at the end of the day.
So our job is to protect wherever we can, but we encourage and want to have buyer-seller meetings when we feel like it's a good fit.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the common questions. So some of these we'll ask on the front end, in a seller interview or in a sim, but most of the same stuff is asked at these meetings, and maybe it's not covered in some of the cursory work that we do. What are some of the common questions that you hear?
You already mentioned the one. Why are you selling the business? What do you plan to do post closing? They want to know. What you're you're going to be staying in town. You're going to be moving overseas, moving over out of state. And then you kind of break through every kind of category.
Yep.
So there might be a lot of questions about the employees. Who
probably the heaviest topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Key employees.
Who your key employees are.
Do you think the employees will stay?
Yeah.
Do they know about the sale? And most times,
how long have the employees been there?
Yes. You want to make sure continuity with the employees when somebody's buying a business, especially when there's a lot of employees. It's important to know how long they've been there. Are there key ones that rely on this business, not necessarily rely on the owner, right? They need a job. Do you think they're going to stay? Are they good at their job? Do they like what they do? Are they passionate about it? So employees is a pretty heavy topic.
That's one area that they really zero in on. And I think another one, sticking with the labor portion of the business, is the owner's role themselves.
Yes.
What's the owner doing in the business? What does their day-to-day work life look like? How many hours a week are they working? Are you able to take vacations and enjoy the vacation? And how tied are you to the business when you do go on vacations? Anything owner related.
Yeah, because in most cases, for a Main Street business, and we'll talk about Main Street and M&A and different size businesses in a later episode, but a buyer is typically coming in when they buy a Main Street business, they are going to do what the seller was doing. So they are going to say, Mr. Seller, if you're gone, what responsibilities is it that I have to take on? Or I have to find somebody to take over if it's not within my skill set? So, it is really an interview of, in your business that you run, what do you do? Because that's the first thing that I, as the incoming buyer, need to know that I'm going to have to take over.
Yeah. I mean, Carey, that's like the biggest question when the biggest question the buyer's having inside their head when they're going down that road of what the owner's role is am I able to take over that role? What is my day-to-day life going to look like? What are the struggles that you face? That's a big question that we hear a lot. What kind of struggles? What kind of things keep you up at night? So anything like that, the buyer's trying to picture themselves in that situation. Am I able to operate and run this business? And then that kind of naturally goes towards training, what training might look like, post-closing. So the buyer will start asking, how long will you stay post-closing to train me? And on a smaller business, it's usually smaller businesses, easier to operate businesses. Usually 2 weeks is included in the sales price. Bigger businesses or businesses that have a lot more complexities to it, it's usually a month. But
longer.
It's a month included.
Yes.
And a lot of times though, that if it is a bigger business or a business that has a lot of complexities, you as the seller should be thinking, okay, maybe a month is included in the asking price, but you should be willing to say, hey, I'm going to work for a couple months or 6 months or a year, at least a couple months for additional pay, and that pay would not be what your unfortunately normally receiving as a business owner, but more of a fair market salary. But that's important. And then it could also be a consulting portion. So you're training, for free for a month. Maybe you're sticking around for a couple months on top of that at a fair market salary. And then maybe a couple months after that, maybe it's a monthly retainer for a consulting basis where you can pick up the phone, you can talk to them, or the buyer can have you come in once in a while to the office and things like that.
It's a negotiation point a lot of times too, because a buyer, is a little apprehensive buying a business and they want to feel secure in the decision they're making. And when a seller goes, yeah, I'll stay on for a longer period of time, and I could charge you X or Y afterwards, and whenever you don't need me anymore, I'll go on my way, right? So it becomes a conversation part of a buyer-seller meeting, but it's also a negotiation part of every single one of these contracts. And one question that I know that you and I always ask a seller in a seller interview, and this is usually a different answer depending on where the seller is in their business cycle or in their life. If you were to stay on and keep running this business, what would you do to grow it? What are the growth opportunities? How can this business get to the next level? Because it's very rare that a buyer is going to buy a business and go, I'm going to keep the business the same and just leave it where it's at. No, a buyer wants to come in and grow, and the seller seller has the best knowledge on how to grow it. So I think it's a fascinating question, and a lot of times, if a buyer is a strategic buyer, they already know certain ways that they can grow the business, and they're trying to find out what is the barrier or obstacle to get that growth.
Yeah. And they're really asking the seller, how would you do it? If you stayed in the business and you continue to operate, they generally want to know. But at the same time, they are going to turn around and ask the question, well, why aren't you doing that now?
Yep.
So be ready for that type of a question. Sticking on that type of path, I think also a big part of the questions they're going to ask is going to be around the customer or the client.
Oh, of course.
Space of selling, their business.
How have you acquired your customers in the past? Do your customers have the relationship with the business, someone in the business, or you?
Do you have a client or a customer that makes up a large percentage of your revenue?
Yep.
That big client that if they walk out the door, what's going to happen? Would that take a big chunk out of there? Down to, how you just interact and work with the clients and customers. Who's talking to the clients and the customers the most? Is that the business owner, or is it a key employee, or is it somebody else at the company? Who's doing most of that interaction?
Yeah.
That can start getting into billing, how the billing's handled. Is there some kind of terms and what those terms look like?
Do you have long-term contracts?
Recurring revenue?
Yeah.
It depends on the business a lot going down that road, that they're going to have specific questions depending on that.
And for us, as we go industry to industry, we have to be ready. I mean, it's very rare that just there's silence in a buyer-seller meeting where we actually have to interject ourselves and put it back onto track. But if it is, we're going through those paths, and as we go industry to industry, as brokers, we have to have deep knowledge in each industry so that we can ask the questions relative to the industry.
Yeah.
For example, you mentioned reoccurring revenue. There's a lot of businesses like construction businesses. Most of those are just one-off contracts. Maybe you land a lot of them in a row, but other businesses maybe like I sold a security business, and it was all about monitoring on a monthly basis. So what does your attrition look like? How many recurring customers do you have? How long are those contracts? Right. Historically, have they broken those contracts? How do you get new contracts? So customer acquisition, customer stability, I think it typically goes, why are you selling? Let's talk about the employees. Let's talk about the customers, and then all this other stuff.
Right. And those are probably the biggest categories. But then, you already touched on those, the marketing and advertising. How are you doing the marketing and advertising? And if you do X, do you get Y results? And what have you tried that's worked? What have you tried that's not worked? What would you recommend? What would you want to do if you wanted to keep the business? And is there any new kind of marketing and advertising that you would be doing to do that?
And some people come in and they see, so I'm selling a business right now, and it's an antiquated business. He runs everything through Excel. He doesn't use any software. Never once marketed or advertised in his 30-year history. Everything has been word of mouth. So as a buyer, I look at this as an opportunity, right? The buyer that just got under contract is a marketer by trade. So they're coming in and saying, well, I'm big into software. I'm going to automate a lot of these processes. I'm a marketer, so I'm going to go try to grow the business.
Carey, that's funny because the last 5 or so years, I think technology type questions have been more important than ever, than I ever saw in the 20 years before that. A lot of buyers asking, what kind of technology is being used, things like that. And, if you're a business owner out there and you're not using a lot of technology in your business right now, I've talked to business owners, they don't even have a website. They don't have a email that is specific to their company. It's like at AOL.com or at gmail.com. They're not using any technology in the business. That is not a negative on the business at all. Because I look at that, if the business is really successful, it's doing good revenue numbers, it's doing a great bottom line or discretionary earnings number, and they don't even have a website, and they're not doing any marketing and advertising, it's kind of like to the buyer, wow, could you imagine what you could do if you had a website, if you were doing marketing and advertising? Could you imagine how more efficient the business would be by implementing technology? So if you're a business owner out there and you're thinking about selling and you're listening to this and you're like, well, I don't even have a website, I have no technology, anything like that, a buyer's gonna be looking at it going, if that person has a great business and they have none of that, imagine what I could do with that business if I implemented all those types of things. So don't worry about that.
Yes, I agree. And, it goes into scalability, right? I hear a lot of times, well, I see that you've grown here to here. What would it take to go from here to here?
Right.
How would you scale your business? What would have been the barriers and obstacles to scale it?
What kind of new employees would I need to bring on? What's the more furniture, fixtures, and equipment that I would need to bring on?
That's a good point.
Like that.
So, if you're walking around a facility with equipment, capital expenditures, what pieces of equipment when we're walking around and doing a tour look like they might be on their last life cycle.
Yeah. Talking about the condition of the equipment, when do you think I'll need to replace this kind of equipment? What's my CapEx expense going to be? On a typical year, anything about the equipment is good.
A question that I like that buyers ask is, what are the challenges of running your business? And they kind of get into this mini SWOT analysis. So, if you're selling your business and you're in a buyer-seller meeting and you're a seller, you're going to talk about the strengths, you're going to talk about the opportunities because you're selling your business. But you also need to talk about the weaknesses. You got to talk about the threats. You got to talk about the parts of your business that is scary or that you do have concerns about. Because if you're not addressing those questions, one, they're going to come up. Two, you're not bringing comfort to the buyer by showing that this is not a perfect business. You got to show some vulnerability as a seller in a buyer-seller meeting because that's what makes you more human, right? This is a human buying a business from a human.
Well, that's also, one, you should, when you're selling your business, you should put everything on the table, and say the good, the bad, and the ugly. You're not there, and we're going to get to this later, but you're not there to sell your business. You're there to explain to the buyer, hey, this is everything that you want to know about my business. Here it is. Because the last thing you want to do is have problems post-closing that are legal because you didn't disclose something negative about the business. And it's also the ethical thing to do. And then also a side thing to that, a lot of times a buyer will look at that and go, I really like that seller. I really trust them. They were being honest about everything, and that's building that relationship and that rapport. And at the end of the day, no matter how wonderful your business is that you have, every business is not perfect. There's no perfect business out there. Every business can improve upon something. So disclosing that information, I think, is critical from a legal standpoint. It's critical from an ethical standpoint. But I also think that the buyer respects that from the seller.
I mean, a question that I've come to ask, in a, I don't know if it's considered an analogy, but I say outright, what are the skeletons in the closet?
Absolutely. I want to know the skeletons up front as a business broker.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because
we don't want to be shocked.
Those are obstacles that we're going to have to face down the road. And the better we can face those and overcome those obstacles up front, we're saving everybody's time. The seller's time, the buyer's time, our time. And it doesn't mean the deal's not going to go through if there's a skeleton. There's obstacles. There's all kinds of obstacles when you're selling a business. That's part of our job is getting through those obstacles. Absolutely.
So in the beginning of a relationship, Mr. Seller, your business isn't perfect. You got some skeletons in the closet. Let's address them now and come up with a strategy on how we can discuss it, how we can talk about it. Maybe one customer makes up a huge portion of your revenue. Let's put that up front and let people know, because if that's a deal breaker, no need to continue down.
Well, a few years ago, Carey, I had a business that the gentleman wanted to sell. And he had owned that business for like 20 some years. And there was a competitor that was going to be opening up a block down the road. And the seller told me that in the first meeting. First time I met with him, he told me that. And he goes, I'm not worried about it. And what ended up happening is it was not a big deal, because He'd been in business for 20 some years, and he was naming all these national companies that had come in over 20 years, that came in, they failed, and that was it. That was not the reason he was selling the business, and he was used to facing that kind of competition. And the buyers understood that. Now, we don't have time to go through the whole story here, but the buyers understood that. And they were like, yeah, nope, I believe the seller, and they didn't have the problem post-closing. The person that did buy the business didn't have a problem post-closing.
But you brought it up at the forefront of the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe I didn't bring it up in the very first conversation that I had with the buyer, but it was a conversation I had with the buyer prior to them having any kind of conversation with the seller, because handling that is critical, because if the seller wouldn't have told me that, I wouldn't have been able to tell the buyer. And then what would have happened is we might have gone under contract with the buyer, and the buyer finds out in due diligence and goes, oh, wait a minute, there's a competitor moving in a block down the road. That's why they're selling. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And then they're like, no. And then they lose that trust factor with the seller. And that's what we keep saying, is that trust factor is critical both ways.
I think in business and in life and everything, being assumptuous or presumptuous, making assumptions is lethal, right? Yeah. Especially when you have an opportunity to combat it in the beginning. A lot of times when I'm talking to a buyer on a business, or through one or two conversations, I'm bringing up all those red flags, and we want to know them. I did a deal where we were about to close, and not only had the buyer or the seller not told me about this, I asked and he said no. I said, are there any open legal issues with your business? Come to find out, right before closing, there was an open lawsuit, there was an open taxation issue, and I think we ended up closing that one, but it took an extra 6 months for them to resolve it. We could have been working on that since day one. The buyer just pushed it under the rug and said, we'll deal with it later. That's just not the way to do it.
The best thing is, if you're looking to sell your business, is when you talk to your broker, and hopefully it's Carey or I, you put everything on the table. And let's talk about that, the positives and the negatives. Going back to questions that buyers tend to ask, vendor or supplier questions are usually pretty critical.
Yes, they are.
Are you dependent on just one supplier? Is there other suppliers I can get things from? What's the price factor? If they raise the prices, do you think they're going to raise the prices? Is anything changing with the vendors and suppliers? So those are the type of questions.
And it's mostly risk mitigation, because when you're buying a business, what you're trying to do is mitigate as much risk as possible. If it's a business that's been around for a while, you can actually see historical trends of what's happened, but you want to ask those deep-rooted questions, customer concentration, supplier concentration, competition. We didn't even discuss competition. Well, a little bit, but that's a big part. So, going down all of the common questions, there are themes. I kind of look at them as chapters, and those will come up almost every time. And then there's some obscure questions. You mentioned technology becoming a big part. I know something that you've always brought up is your business Amazon proof? How is artificial intelligence affecting your business? So the dialogue has changed.
Is a recession resilient?
COVID, what happened during COVID?
Yeah.
It's fun. And the businesses that have been around for a long time, they have so much history and so many stories. I like when buyer or sellers are telling stories about the business, how they helped out a customer, an employee that's been with them since day one. That's the type of stuff that makes you feel really good.
You've said so much, my mind is going. Like, when going back to the employee situation, buyers like it when they're talking to a business owner and they feel like the business owner has been taking care of the employees.
Oh, yeah.
They're paying them well. They may or may not be giving them benefits. A lot of small business owners can't do that, but how they treat the employees, what the culture is like. Those intangible things, like the culture of the business and how the employees are treated and how they view the business, that's very important to a buyer.
Without a question, without a doubt.
And you mentioned a question also, Carey, that they tend to ask. They ask, who are your competitors? And I'm going to tell you, the worst response you can give as a business owner when you're asked who your competitors are is to say, I don't have any competitors. There is not a business out there that does not have competitors. It's just, they're going to spend your money with here, or they're going to spend their money here. It's they're all that choice. And by saying you have no competitors, the buyer immediately is losing that trust factor. And it's okay to say, hey, these tend to be my biggest competitors, A, B, C, D, E. These are the strengths that these competitors have. These are their weaknesses. This is what we do better than them. This is what they do better than us. It's okay to say that. That's business. And I think every competition with business owners is that, some businesses will do something better and the other one will do better, but there's room for growth and improvement there.
No doubt.
And then financial questions. There's a lot of questions about financials.
Yeah.
Why is your cost of goods gone up 6% versus the revenue last year, or down, or whatever it is, or just specific financial questions.
And the ones that relate to maybe benchmarking or just general operations, we like those. But there's some do's and don'ts. This is a good segue.
Yeah, right.
Do's and don'ts. Because I'm thinking of all the don'ts that I try to coach. Because this is a process for us of education, right? We have to educate, in most cases, our sellers how to go about doing this. If it's your first time and you're looking to sell your business, you are not alone. We are here to coach you through the entire process. These buyer-seller meetings can be intimidating. When you go into your first one, you're not going into it blind. We're going to talk to you about what to expect, and then we're going to tell you some of these do's and don'ts. Let's get into that.
Right, absolutely. And I want to say, before we get into the do's and don'ts, it's the golden rule for me is just be honest and ethical in the buyer-seller meeting. Any questions are asked, say it the way it is. Just be blunt about it. That you want to be transparent. Again, you want to stay away from any legal type of issue, any ethical type of an issue. You want the buyer going in kind of with their eyes wide open to the situation. But it's kind of like an attorney preparing a witness to take the stand. They're not telling the witness to lie. They're telling the witness to be truthful, and they got to be truthful in their response, but they're prepping them on how they can handle being up there as a witness, because most people have never stood on that witness stand. They need to know how to expect to know how it's going to feel and what it's going to be like.
Respond to the objections.
That's kind of like what we're doing. If a business owner that I'm helping, if they want me to kind of coach them prior to a buyer-seller meeting, absolutely. Yep. This is what you can expect. These are the questions they're probably going to ask. But the whole thing comes back to being honest and ethical about your responses.
Yep. And it's funny because most of the do's and don'ts, because we wrote some down that we want to share, every do has the opposite don't. So do this or
right.
So as a broker, first starting with us, I give myself my own do's and don'ts. I like to talk a lot. I'm the one that usually dominates a conversation. So I have to tell myself, do allow the buyer and seller to interact with the least amount of interruptions as possible. I literally tell myself that before I walk in. Do your thing, set the stage, let them go.
Carey, I think that's fantastic, because that's the biggest thing is, we do co-broke with other brokers.
Yep.
And, there's some brokers that are like us and have the same philosophy. And then there's other brokers that tend to make themselves a big part of that buyer-seller meeting. And my viewpoint is this, is as a broker, we've done all this work prior to getting to the buyer-seller meeting. And then after that buyer-seller meeting, we have all the stuff we need to do. But during the buyer-seller meeting itself, we should kind of outline how the meeting's going to go as far as the agenda. But for the most part, we need to not say much. And my feeling is that's the opportunity for the buyer to get to know the seller, and the seller to get to know the buyer, and them two to start building a relationship and building a bond. Every time a broker, myself, or somebody else interrupts or starts injecting themselves into the conversation, we're ruining that chance of them building that bond. And I really think in the buyer-seller meeting, we have to do as little talking as we possibly can.
Yes.
Now, there's times that we do have to talk.
Yes.
Like the times that I interject is like when a buyer asks the seller a question, the seller starts answering that question, but then they get off topic and they start veering down another road. And I don't want the buyer to think that the seller is avoiding that question. So when they get done talking, I'll say, so-and-so buyer, I think what they're asking was this. Oh, and the seller goes, oh, yeah, and then brings them across.
Yeah.
Or if they're talking, and I can kind of tell because I know a lot about the business. I've had many, many conversations with the seller that there might be some things that the seller's leaving out, not purposely, just forgetting. And I might intervene and go, oh, yeah, but remember you're talking about blah, blah, blah. And he'll go, oh, yeah, you're right, da-da-da-da. Or if there's a miscommunication, I think, the seller's responding or the buyer's responding to something, and I can tell that the other one party or both parties there's just miscommunication.
Yeah.
But other than that kind of stuff, I don't really do much at a buyer-seller meeting, and I tell the buyer and the seller that up front, that I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
That's their time.
There's often a lot of tangents, so we can try to affect some tangents that are going on. I always say, do allow the seller to give all the details. Like you don't really need to leave details out. If you feel like it's important, it's something you want to talk about, I try not to, unless it's a story.
Yeah.
And There's times where we're just like, all right, well, what other questions do you have, Mr. Buyer?
That's a good point, Carey, because sometimes you go into these buyer-seller meetings and the buyer has 30 questions they want to ask. And they ask their first question, and then the seller talks for like 10 minutes about the one question. And you got to remember, as a seller, the buyer probably does have a list of questions, and you want to give a complete answer to the questions. But remember, there's probably a whole list of questions they have to ask. So we do have to get through those pretty quick. So don't spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes on one response.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about structure of these, you already mentioned that it's typically not done during working hours, right? So you don't want to alert or alarm any of the employees. So we typically say, hey, it should just be the owner of the business, unless there's a key employee that knows about it.
Or a spouse.
Or a spouse. Yeah. So nights, weekends, before, after, do try to meet at a period of time where there's not a lot of people around. Another thing, too, is people always want to meet at the facility or at the business. Mm-hmm. So what I typically do is, depending on how many employees are involved or whatnot, we'll meet at the business, we do a quick tour, and then sometimes we'll go over to a Starbucks or a Panera.
Yeah, some kind of coffee shop or
dinner,
something. Yeah,
something where they can sit down and ask questions in a relaxed environment, because the seller's always going to have their guard up, maybe a little bit if they're in their place of work. Sometimes they're looking around to see if anyone's there.
Is Joe the manager around or anything like that? And I do that a lot too, where we'll meet at a coffee shop first, have a good discussion, and then go to the business and just do a quick tour for like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And sometimes as a broker, I don't even go to that quick tour because we don't want to have a ton of people running through the business if it is during operating hours.
Yeah.
So we'll all meet at a coffee shop, have a little hour meeting, and then afterwards the buyer and the seller go to the shop, go to the business, walk around for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll call it a day.
Another do that I have that I've, I guess I've done this every time, maybe without knowing it, but now I call it out. I say, what is the next step? Okay, the meeting's done. What's the next step? Buyer, do you have any more questions? Seller, do you have any more questions? I've taken my notes of the things that weren't able to be answered, because if a question can't be answered, I want the seller to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll get back to you. I'll go look at my financial statement, or I'll go talk to this employee about how they do X, Y, or Z. So I always want to make sure that when it's done, I talk about what the next step is. Sometimes there's enough interest where the buyer wants to move forward at that meeting. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and send you a purchase contract, or the purchase contract's done. You're ready to sign off on due diligence. I'm going to send you a contingency release. So I try to be very clear about what is the next step if you're at that point, because sometimes you really don't know. You have to collect the feedback from the seller and the buyer when they depart. Mr. Seller, did you like the buyer? Mr. Buyer, are you still interested on the business? Mm-hmm. So it's just making sure you get that feedback, and then I'm going to be in touch with everybody afterwards, or if you're co-broking, whatever the broker's name is.
I like the honest feedback from the buyers. Honestly, why they don't want to move forward. Is that something that me and the seller can work on to improve it, for the next buyer, or maybe there's a miscommunication. I've had situations where we walk away from a meeting and the buyer says, I don't want to buy this business because of this reason. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I think you misinterpreted what was going on. That's not like that. And then you talk to the buyer, and the buyer's like, oh, okay, I misinterpreted that. And you're like, okay, and you get everything back on track.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think a seller needs to keep in mind is not to try to sell their business.
Yep.
Now, obviously, they're trying to sell their business, but what I mean by that is not to try to be a salesperson. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And you're not
inorganic.
Yeah,
or
just be you. Like, Carey, we've had these conversations. I've turned down listings, working with a business owner where they have a great business, but I don't like and trust the seller. You know what I mean? That's a big component of whether I want to work with a seller. Are they likable and trustworthy? One, I'm going to have to work with this person for multiple months. They're going to have to work with me for multiple months. Every time I call them, I don't want to be like, I have to call so-and-so. Yeah. And I don't want them to feel that way. I have to call Jim, blah, blah, blah. There's got to be, we don't have to be best friends, but a lot of times I end up being really good friends with the people I work with. But we don't have to be best friends, but we have to have a relationship that we respect, and we have a good rapport with each other. And that likability and trustworthy is important for me. And it's also important for a buyer, and a buyer feels that as well.
So there's two great don'ts. Don't oversell your business.
Yes.
And another
Just
one.
be you.
Yeah.
You're trustworthy.
Yeah.
You're a good person. That's why I want to work with you. Get that across to the buyer. Show your true self.
And also, don't make it an interrogation, right?
Oh my
We
gosh,
talked
from a
that.
buyer's
The
perspective.
buyer sits down, he's drilling questions at it. No. You guys are having a conversation if this is a good fit, nothing more than that. So sometimes the buyer is hammering down questions in a sometimes a rude, disrespectful manner.
Interrogating them.
Yeah.
I've been in those meetings where a buyer's got these questions, and the way they're presenting, they're interrogating that seller, like, just grilling them, like basically saying your business stinks and why are you operating it this way? Why are you there even looking at the business if you feel that way? Show respect for the seller. Even if you realize during that buyer-seller meeting that you do not want to move forward, there's no reason to slam the seller or the seller's business at all. Mm-hmm. Just be, okay, I think I got enough information that I need, and then depart. And then at that time afterwards, talk to us and say, hey, this is what I don't like about it, da-da-da. But don't slam the seller. I've seen those instances too many times over the last 25 years.
Yeah.
And if you do like the business, as a buyer, if you come across like that, the seller's not going to want to sell your business to you. So sell their business to you. So
something that I think you and I, always prompt. I think I almost always prompt this to a seller, because the seller asks me these questions going into a buyer-seller meeting: is this a forum for negotiation? Because we typically handle most of the negotiation. So if a buyer just starts immediately saying, would you hold a seller's note? Would you consider a reduced price? Now, there's times in a buyer-seller meeting where you've had so many meetings and it's time for brass tacks. Let's talk if we can get a deal done or not. But more times than not,
I'd rather leave the negotiation out of that buyer-seller meeting.
Of course.
Because I want them to have a good rapport, between themselves.
Yeah.
And when you start negotiating, and you're negotiating the price, and you're getting very specific in terms, that can create a lot of ill will, and parties can get offended. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of what we do as brokers, is we're that barrier. And I don't say this much because I like that transparency, but I think when it comes to negotiation, you need that kind of barrier. So the buyer's not getting the seller upset, the seller's not getting the buyer upset. There's emotion involved. We're taking that all out, and we're skilled and got the experience to kind of negotiate in a way with both parties, or when we're negotiating, that it comes across not emotional,
You bring up
and not offensive.
You bring up a really good point, and I think one of the advantages of using a business broker is no matter how many times you say as a seller, this is business, there's no emotion in it. When you're selling your business, it's emotional. And it's very difficult to negotiate on your own behalf when you've owned a business for so long and you feel this type of feeling towards your business. Using a business broker and allowing them to negotiate on your behalf ultimately is probably not only going to bring you a higher price, it's going to be easier, it's going to take less years off your life, and I highly encourage you to allow the brokers who are here to negotiate on your behalf and for the transaction to let them do their job. Don't try to negotiate your own business, and please don't try to sell your own business. It's very hard to do that.
And I talk about that selling. I got a story. This happened years ago.
Let's hear it.
So we had a buyer-seller meeting, and the seller was spent the whole time like selling the business really hard to the buyer. It came across very salesy. Mm-hmm. He was talking about how great the business is, and I mean he had the business like way up here. It was a good solid business, but he had the business way up here and boasting, and it came across very salesy. And so afterwards, I sat down with him and I said, look, don't try to sell the business, and don't make everything more perfect than it really is. Just be honest. It's okay to say some negative things about the business, and that's actually what you should be doing, and buyers like that.
How did he or she take the feedback?
Well, then we had the next buyer-seller meeting we had with another buyer. The business owner spent the whole time slamming the business. And I was like, seriously, you just
took it to the other extreme.
Took the other extreme. And spent an hour just to take the smallest little issue and making it a big thing.
That buyer didn't buy the business.
It kept doing it. Neither buyer bought the thing.
You did?
No, neither one.
Yeah.
Neither one. It's just going back. Just be yourself. Be who you are. Tell the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that's it.
A couple of the so we wrote down some of these. A couple of the ones that I actually giggled at because we both build the list together. Some of the don'ts. I've learned this one the hard way. Obviously, don't talk politics. I never brought it up, but I've had a seller who did, and you've told the story in one of our other one of our other Boss Talk episodes about the person who had all the political flags and everything,
Yeah.
how they went down south. You wrote one on here that I thought was comical. Don't pray before the meeting. Have you actually
Oh
had that
my
happen?
gosh, yeah. So I had a buyer seller meeting. This is going back a couple of years, and I love the seller. I love the seller. But we sat down at a meeting, and he goes, "Yeah, before we start, I like to pray." And so he was Christian, and I respect that. I think that's fantastic. He started praying, but all that kept running through my head was, I know the other broker's Jewish, and I'm pretty sure the buyer's Jewish, and it just came across like. And I kind of looked up and I could see the broker and the buyer kind of looking
at each other.
Looking at each other.
Yeah.
And, it's just, I think you keep politics, you keep religion out of the conversations.
Yes.
You know?
And in most business conversations, that's for the best.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Was that Jewish broker?
I don't even think me and you, no, it wasn't. I don't even think me and you have ever really sat down and talked politics.
No,
We've been business owners for years.
And I'm good with that.
I am good with that too.
Yeah, we can talk religion, but
Yeah.
no politics.
Right.
That's great. Yeah, so a lot of do's, a lot of don'ts, and ultimately with buyer-seller meetings, I think what we've got across to our audience today is that everyone's different. Every buyer-seller meeting's different, but there's a lot of structure to buyer-seller meetings. And I think a couple high-level takeaways are: be honest, be transparent, be ethical, understand that you are trying to build a relationship first. You're there with goals and objectives to ask questions and answer questions, but don't make it out to be something bigger than it is.
I'm glad you said that, Carey, because that's what was going through my mind is don't make it bigger than it really is. I mean, don't look at this as, don't stress yourself about it. We're just a couple people. We're all going to sit down. There's going to be a small group of us. We're going to sit down and we're just going to chit chat and talk, and that's it. And just be yourself, whether you're the buyer or you're the seller.
Now, leading up to it, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, you have any questions? We're here to answer. We're here to coach. But we appreciate you listening to what we had to say today about buyer-seller meetings, and we hope you continue to watch our series Boss Talk as we talk about selling businesses. On behalf of Boss Group, Jim Parker, and myself, Carey Sobel, we thank you for joining in.
Very much thank you for joining in, and if you're looking to sell your business, give us a call.